At 3:15 in the afternoon on Wednesday, March 7, 1945, a column of American armored vehicles approached the western bank of the Rhine River near the German town of Remagen. The lead formation belonged to Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, part of 1st United States Army under General Courtney Hodges. Their operational mission that afternoon was simple: advance east as quickly as possible after the collapse of German defenses west of the Rhine. But no American unit expected what appeared through the haze ahead: a bridge, still standing. The structure was the Ludendorff Bridge, a steel railway bridge built during the First World War. It stretched roughly 1,000 feet across the Rhine River, linking Remagen on the western bank to the town of Erpel on the eastern side. Thick stone towers guarded both entrances, each originally designed to house heavy defensive guns. For months, German command had declared that every bridge across the Rhine would be destroyed before any Allied soldier reached it. The Rhine was not just another river, it was the final natural barrier protecting the industrial heart of Western Germany. If Allied forces crossed it intact, the war inside Germany would accelerate dramatically. The lead American unit approaching Remagen was commanded by Brigadier General William M. Hogue, commander of Combat Command B. At the front of the column were tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion and infantry from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. The first American soldier to clearly identify the bridge was Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, commander of Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Through binoculars, he could see something even more surprising. German soldiers were still on the bridge. They were preparing to destroy it. Inside the eastern bridge tower, German engineer units from the 343rd Volksgrenadier Division had wired demolition charges along the steel trusses and bridge piers. Their orders were direct from Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B. No intact crossing of the Rhine could be allowed. The demolition system included thousands of pounds of explosives, wired through electrical circuits connected to a firing switch inside the eastern tower. But the German situation at Remagen was chaotic. The demolition team had suffered from weeks of Allied air attacks that disrupted communications and supply deliveries. Many of the heavier demolition charges, originally intended for the bridge, had already been diverted to other defensive positions. Worse still, some electrical wiring had been damaged by earlier American artillery fire. The officer responsible for the demolition was Captain Willy Bratsch, a German engineer commander under immense pressure. His men had spent the morning repairing circuits and reconnecting wires that had been severed. As American tanks closed to within 800 yards, Bratsch made the decision: destroy the bridge immediately. At 3:20 in the afternoon, he gave the order to detonate. German engineers triggered the firing switch. Across the river, American soldiers saw a violent explosion erupt from the center span. A huge cloud of smoke and dust climbed above the steel framework. For several seconds, the entire bridge vanished inside the blast. Lieutenant Timmerman lowered his binoculars. Everyone waited. When the smoke cleared, the steel structure still stood. Several sections of the deck had been torn open, and parts of the rail line hung twisted over the river. But the main load-bearing arches remained intact. The demolition had failed. Inside the eastern tower, Captain Bratsch realized the worst possible outcome had occurred. The explosives had damaged the bridge, but had not destroyed the supporting trusses. The Rhine crossing still existed. From a strategic perspective, this moment instantly transformed the entire Western Front. Until that afternoon, Allied command believed that every Rhine bridge would be destroyed, forcing large-scale river assault operations that would take weeks to organize. Now a single armored division had discovered a gateway into Germany. General Hogue understood the significance immediately. If the bridge could be seized before the Germans tried again, the United States Army could push forces across the Rhine days or even weeks earlier than planned. But the opportunity carried enormous risk. The damaged bridge might collapse under heavy weight. German artillery units east of the river were already moving into firing positions, and demolition charges might still remain inside the structure. Lieutenant Timmerman did not wait for extended orders. He assembled roughly 100 infantry soldiers from Company A, supported by tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion and machine gun fire from Company B of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Their objective was simple and terrifying: run across the bridge. At 3:35 in the afternoon, the first American soldiers began sprinting onto the damaged steel deck of the Ludendorff Bridge. Above them, loose cables swung in the wind. Below them, the Rhine River moved fast and cold through the broken sections of the structure. And somewhere inside the bridge framework, unexploded demolition charges were still wired into place. No one yet knew if the Germans had a second detonator, or how much time remained before they tried again. At 3:35 in the afternoon on March 7, 1945, the first American infantrymen stepped onto the damaged deck of the Ludendorff Bridge. They belonged to Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, led by Lieutenant Karl Timmerman. Behind them, tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion positioned their guns toward the eastern bank, firing high explosive shells into German defensive positions near the town of Erpel. The bridge surface was barely usable. Sections of the railway track had been ripped apart by the failed demolition. A wooden planking that allowed vehicles to pass had splintered. Twisted steel beams hung over the edge of the structure where the explosion had torn through the center span. In several places, the infantry had to climb over broken metal and dangling cables just to keep moving forward. But the greatest danger was invisible. German engineers had not only planted demolition charges along the main arches, they had also placed additional explosive bundles inside the bridge framework, wired to backup circuits. If any of those charges detonated while the soldiers were on the structure, the entire span could collapse into the Rhine. Lieutenant Timmerman divided his men into small assault groups of roughly 10 soldiers each. Machine gunners set up covering fire at the western bridge tower while riflemen began moving forward along both sides of the narrow deck. German defenders were still inside the eastern tower. Elements of the 976th Grenadier Regiment of the 343rd Volksgrenadier Division had positioned machine guns in the tower windows, firing bursts across the length of the bridge. The distance between the towers was roughly 1,000 feet, leaving American infantry fully exposed during the crossing. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a squad leader from Company A, moved with the first group. He ran along the left side railing while German bullets struck sparks from the steel beams overhead. Halfway across the bridge, another explosion erupted. German engineers had managed to trigger a secondary demolition charge placed under the bridge deck. The blast tore a larger hole in the roadway, sending debris falling into the river. But once again, the main steel arches held. The bridge remained standing. Drabik and his squad jumped across the shattered section and continued forward. Behind them, more American infantry followed. Within minutes, nearly 100 soldiers were spread across the damaged span. From a strategic standpoint, every second mattered. If the Germans destroyed the bridge now, the entire assault force would be trapped on the structure with no escape. If the Americans captured the eastern tower quickly enough, they could prevent any further demolition attempts. Lieutenant Timmerman pushed his men forward with a simple instruction: do not stop. As the lead squads approached the eastern end, German resistance began to collapse. The defenders had not expected an assault across a bridge that had already been detonated. Inside the eastern tower, Captain Willy Bratge, the German engineer commander responsible for the demolition, faced an impossible situation. The electrical circuits used to trigger the main explosives had failed earlier. Now the Americans were only seconds away from reaching the tower entrance. Bratge ordered his remaining soldiers to withdraw toward the hills east of the river. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sergeant Drabik and several infantrymen reached the eastern tower doorway. They forced their way inside. A brief firefight erupted in the narrow corridors of the stone tower. Within minutes, the remaining German defenders surrendered. The Ludendorff Bridge had been captured. American soldiers now stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine River. For the first time in the war, a large Allied ground force had crossed the final natural defensive barrier protecting western Germany. News of the capture reached General Courtney Hodges, commander of 1st United States Army, only minutes later. His reaction was immediate. Reinforcements had to move across the bridge as quickly as possible. Within the next hour, engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion arrived at the bridge entrance. Their mission was not simply repair work, it was survival engineering under combat conditions. German artillery units positioned in the hills east of Erpel had already begun firing shells toward the bridge. Every impact shook the damaged steel structure. Engineers moving across the deck discovered a frightening reality. The original demolition had weakened several support members of the bridge truss. Large steel beams were bent or cracked. Sections of the deck were hanging only by twisted metal. Yet tanks and armored vehicles still needed to cross. Thousands of Allied troops were now preparing to push through this narrow gateway into Germany. If the bridge collapsed, the entire advance would stop. But the engineers had another concern. The Germans were preparing a response. Across the eastern hills, units from 15th Army and 5th Panzer Army were already receiving orders from Field Marshal Walter Model. Their objective was simple: destroy the bridge at any cost. Artillery bombardment would begin immediately. Air attacks would follow. And if those methods failed, German combat engineers would attempt one final solution: underwater demolition. As the first American tanks slowly rolled onto the damaged bridge at 5:30 in the afternoon, engineer officers realized that holding the crossing might become more difficult than capturing it. Because the Ludendorff Bridge was no longer just a bridge, it had become the most valuable target in all of Germany. By 6 o'clock in the evening on March 7, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge had transformed from a damaged railway crossing into the most critical engineering site on the Western Front. American infantry already held positions in the hills east of the Rhine near the town of Erpel, but the bridge itself remained fragile. Every vehicle that crossed added stress to steel members already weakened by the failed German demolition. Responsibility for keeping the structure alive fell to the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David B. Pergrin. Pergrin and his engineers moved onto the bridge almost immediately after the infantry secured the eastern tower. What they found was not a stable structure. It was a bridge barely holding itself together. Several lower chord members of the steel truss had been cracked by the explosion earlier that afternoon. Large bolts had sheared off completely. Sections of the railway deck had collapsed into the river, leaving open gaps across the span. Engineers had to repair the bridge while vehicles continued moving across it. The first task was to remove unexploded German demolition charges. Sergeant Joseph de Weide and several engineer specialists crawled inside the bridge framework carrying wire cutters and flashlights. Hidden among the steel beams were bundles of explosives wired into secondary circuits. One charge alone contained roughly 600 pounds of military demolition explosive. If triggered accidentally, the blast could have torn apart a major section of the truss. Working under artillery fire, the engineers cut wires and removed charges piece by piece. Each explosive bundle was thrown off the bridge and into the river below. But the threat from German forces was growing. Beginning shortly after 7:30 in the evening, German artillery units from the east bank began a concentrated bombardment. Shells from 105mm and 150mm artillery guns struck both banks of the river and the bridge itself. Every explosion shook the structure. Still, traffic continued. By midnight, more than 8,000 American soldiers had crossed the Rhine using the damaged bridge. Tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion, tank destroyers from the 19th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and supply vehicles from multiple support units slowly rolled across the narrow deck. Each vehicle crossed one at a time under strict weight control. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin ordered emergency reinforcement operations. Steel support beams were welded onto damaged sections of the truss. Heavy timber braces were installed beneath weakened deck areas. Engineers worked with portable welding equipment while artillery shells continued landing nearby. But German command was not relying on artillery alone. Field Marshal Walter Model ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the bridge using air attacks. Beginning on March 9, German aircraft launched repeated bombing runs against the crossing. Fighters and bombers from several units attempted steep dive attacks against the narrow target. American anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the west bank opened fire immediately. Units equipped with 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and 90mm heavy anti-aircraft artillery created a defensive ring around the bridge. Several German aircraft were shot down during these attacks, but the bombardment forced engineers to continue working under constant threat. Then a new danger emerged: German combat swimmers. During the night of March 11, German Naval Command deployed demolition teams from a special operations unit trained in underwater sabotage. Their mission was to swim through the cold Rhine current carrying explosive charges toward the bridge supports. American engineers anticipated this possibility. Searchlights swept the river surface while patrol boats moved along the banks. Infantry soldiers watched the water for movement. Several swimmers were spotted and fired upon before reaching the bridge. Even with these defenses, the structure continued to weaken. For 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge carried the weight of an entire army pushing into Germany. Engineers reinforced it repeatedly while thousands of vehicles crossed. The strategic impact was enormous. The unexpected Rhine crossing allowed 1st United States Army to establish a large bridgehead on the eastern bank weeks earlier than planned. By mid-March, more than 25,000 Allied troops had crossed through the Remagen corridor. This forced German command to divert divisions away from other defensive sectors, weakening their overall front across western Germany. The collapse of the Rhine defense line had begun, but the bridge itself had reached its limit. At 3 in the afternoon on March 17, 1945, after days of stress, bombardment, and emergency repairs, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way. The weakened steel truss collapsed into the Rhine River. Several American engineers working on final reinforcement tasks were killed when the structure fell. Yet by the time it collapsed, the bridge had already done its work. Additional pontoon bridges built by United States Army engineers were already operating nearby, allowing the steady flow of troops and equipment to continue across the river. The gateway into Germany could no longer be closed. What began with a failed demolition charge and a sprint across a damaged railway bridge had created the first permanent Allied foothold east of the Rhine. Within weeks, Allied armies would spread across western Germany, surrounding the industrial Ruhr region and collapsing the remaining German defenses in the west. The final barrier had fallen, not because the bridge survived forever, but because for 10 critical days engineers refused to let it fall too soon.